it already time for us to have this conversation again? I used to talk about this a lot when I first joined this app, but one of the greatest misconceptions I think regular Americans have.
This is one of the hardest truths for Americans to accept.
Is about the quality of labor in China. As somebody who works in manufacturing and has worked in manufacturing for a really long time, in 2008, there was a massive labor code overhaul in China. Today, workers in China, like minimum wage workers, enjoy a higher pay when you adjust for purchasing power parity. I think Americans do this thing where we think about everything in terms of the US dollar, which makes no sense because people in other countries aren't paying for things with the US dollar. So no, you have to use the purchasing power parity. And when you do that, you see that minimum wage in China, it's regional. It's higher than the federal minimum wage in the United States everywhere. They also have legally mandated paid time off. In the United States, we have none. So yeah, I just think one of the most interesting things that Americans have this conception that workers in China all work in sweatshops are being mistreated. It doesn't mean that labor violations don't happen in China. Labor violations happen everywhere. But the average worker in China, they are doing way better than the average worker in the United States. It is so wild to me that these myths persist, right? Because if you look at the average Chinese worker and you're like, they're exploited, it's well, what does that say about the average American worker then? Because we are doing a lot worse than them.
So this TikTok by Madeline Pendleton points out the harsh reality that the average worker in China is much better off than the average worker in the United States. And one of the big reasons for this is the simple fact that because the cost of living is so low in China, and because they have a home ownership rate of about 90%, most people have a lot more take-home pay as a percentage of their income in China than people do in the United States. People forget how much things cost here, and so while technically Americans nominally make more money than the average worker in China, the average worker in China gets to keep more of that money to spend it on things that they actually want to spend it on. Pair that with the walkable cities, the high-speed transit, and all the other awesome things that China's been doing lately, and the whole idea of China being this terrible place for workers while the United States supports freedom and democracy just sort of crumbles away. I mean, even look at things like zero COVID, for example. It's pointed out as oh, they're so tyrannical and authoritarian. And yet, just a week or two ago, there were a couple of people that had a protest in China about zero COVID. And within just a couple days, the government announced that they were going to shift gears with zero COVID and change things up to loosen up the restrictions a little bit. Which, by the way, as an aside, the people that were in charge of the zero COVID policy actually implementing different restrictions and lockdowns and stuff like that were the local government officials. And it actually varied a lot region by region because people would have periodic lockdowns in individual cities and regions, and then after the COVID outbreak was contained, they would get rid of the lockdown protocols. So most people in China have just been going about life fairly normally because China managed to successfully contain coronavirus. But that's something that's really telling because look at the United States, for example. After the murder of George Floyd, there were huge protests across the entire country in the United States. Record-breaking protests. And what did we get for that? Oh yeah, we got increased police spending and basically nothing when it comes to police accountability or actual reforms or defunding the police or setting up new institutions of public safety. We basically got none of those things that protesters were fighting for. So it turns out that if people protest in China, they can actually get changes from the government very fast, whereas when people protest in the United States of America, we get the opposite of what we want. Sort of funny how that works. Which one of these is the freedom-loving democracy? I don't know, you tell me. But these are the things that is important to understand. Now, why is this? There's a couple reasons behind this. First and foremost, let's just be clear, a lot of Americans are super racist, especially against people in China right now. There's just a ton of racism that lends a ton of Americans to fully accept the idea that everybody in China is brainwashed and they couldn't be as smart as we are. We couldn't possibly be brainwashed at all. And that just plainly is racism at its core. But another layer is institutions like Radio Free Asia, which was quite literally originally set up by the CIA to churn out anti-communist propaganda. And despite the fact that they've got caught several times putting out blatantly false stories, the rest of the media in the United States treats them as legitimate and will push these things about, China, North Korea, Vietnam, you name it, and just push outright lies about any socialist country that they can think of, and especially ones that the United States is in conflict with in one way or another. And so fundamentally, Americans believe a lot of things that just simply aren't true. Then, of course, you've got the American media that takes normal things in China, like, for example, China recently put in place a policy limiting video game and social media time for children, and that gets painted as this, like, evil authoritarian policy, despite the fact that elected representatives in Texas right now are trying to ban anyone under the age of 18 from using social media sites. But at the heart of it is the reality that capitalists in the United States do not want American workers to look at people in China and see things that they want for themselves. What they don't want is for people to look at the successes of a socialist country and think that we should replicate those things here. They don't want American workers to see the benefits that Chinese workers get and say, why aren't we getting those benefits? They don't want American workers to look at the fact that the Chinese government has actually responded to the huge profits of big tech by imposing huge taxes on them and taking money from big tech companies to give to poverty alleviation programs to help fund like public schools and other poverty alleviation programs in some of the most rural and remote parts of China. That is what they don't want you to see, because if we see and hear about those things, if we see and hear about their high-speed rail network, if we see and hear things about their rapid greenification of their economy, or the fact that state intervention has allowed rural farmlands to not only undo a ton of soil erosion and desertification, but actually to increase economic output at the same time. To see the fact that average wages in China have almost tripled over the past 10 years. If we see those things, we might want them for ourselves here. And regardless as to whether or not you like every policy that exists in China, or you agree with every single thing that China has done, the simple fact that they have done so much to alleviate poverty, improve people's working conditions, and give people extra spending cash after their bills are paid, that is something that most Americans would want for themselves. And that is also exactly why capitalists in the United States are working overtime to demonize China. Because if Americans see a socialist country doing better than we are, especially when it comes to taking care of poor folks and working class folks, then more Americans might start to get the idea that socialism actually works. Because it does. And if people come to that realization, then they might start demanding socialism here too. And seeing as how billionaires in China regularly are put in jail for corruption, where billionaires in the United States regularly brag about how much they spend in politics, it's pretty clear why billionaires in the United States wouldn't want us to be more like China, and wouldn't want us to learn a lesson from the successes that China has had over the past several decades. Because if there's one thing American capitalists love more than anything else, it's corruption.